Discuss, hear the concerns of people pro and con for this matter, and hopefully come up with a decision that falls not only within the opinions and passions of folks, but also within the laws of the city, the state, and of course the laws by which we're governed here as a board. Before we get started, I do need to call roll, and at that point, Susan, could I ask you to call roll first? Would you mind, please? No? No? Rick, would you call roll first, please? Make sure we have a quorum.
Yes, Chair, just 1 second.
Like I can call roll instead, but
Somebody call roll.
Paul Fredericks,
Present.
Blair Weaver,
Here.
Charles Roberts,
Here.
Doug Deftouch,
here.
Robert Logue,
Present.
Donnie Jones,
Donnie Jones is absent, but we do have a quorum of 5, so we can hear this case. And just for the sake of those who have not been a part of a Board of Adjustment hearing before, in order to get a variance, the applicant is required to get 4 out of 5 people to vote in favor of the variance. So we postponed this meeting, I guess it was a little over a month ago, or about a month ago, because we had only had 4 people on the board. Donnie, who has been a faithful member of this board for a number of years, was actually in the hospital and was planning on getting out and coming to the board meeting, but his doctor told him at the last minute that he had to stay for another day. So that's why we didn't have a full quorum. I apologize for not having that last time, but again, that shows you the dedication of some of the people who are here. They really want to serve the city and serve you people, and that's what we're all here trying to do tonight. Since we have a quorum, I'd like to ask that we all stand and say the Pledge of Allegiance, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We are here tonight to discuss an issue that I believe we have to discuss after we talk about citizens to be heard, but I would like to just reference this anyhow, so that just in case there's somebody here who's not here to be a part of this, that you would know. Tonight, officially, we are here for a discussion of an action on a request by Cesar Hernandez for a variance to Municipal Code of Ordinances, Chapter 98, zoning, Article 2, District Regulations, Section 98-72, Old Town Helotes Special District, authorizing an encroachment in the required residential buffer of 30 feet, open parentheses, or a street plus 10 feet, close parentheses, where any Old Town Helotes sub-district abuts an existing single-family residential district, parentheses, R1, close parentheses, two-family residential district, open parentheses, R2, close parentheses, and a mobile home district, open parentheses, R3, close parentheses, for the Hacienda del Rio Development Building 2 and 5 to be located at 14743 Old Bandera Road in Helotes, Texas, 78023, more particularly described as BCAD, Prop ID number 1046345. If You all are here to discuss the potential for building a softball field somewhere else in the city. This is not your meeting. If you were here to discuss that matter, we are here to discuss that matter and give everybody ample hearing. The way we typically work this is we start out by allowing the people who have filled out this form called Citizens to be Heard to share their thoughts about this particular project and the reason why we should or shouldn't give a variance in this particular case. I have a variety of requests here to speak. If there is somebody here who has not filled out one of these forms and would like to speak, I would ask you, please go to the back. The forms are in the rear. Fill it out and bring it over to Rick, who will pass it along to me. We want to make sure that justice is done and that anybody who has an opinion gets to share that opinion. With that in mind, I would like to open the public hearing, and I would ask that the first person who has requested to speak is Ron Green. Our meetings, our minutes, and our rules typically call for us to give 3 minutes to a speaker. If you need a tad more, we're not going to beat you over the head. If you need a tad less, nobody will complain, but that's typically what we ask for, just so that we can move things along. Ron, for the record, could I ask you to state your name and your physical address, please?
Yes, sir. My name is Ronald Green. I live at 14255 Antonio Drive. And I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the committee for the opportunity to make comment. I'm talking about this particular project. It may be a little bit slight variation on the variance issue. I only recently became aware of it because I'm beyond 200 feet. But I am a hydrologist, and I've been looking at some of the water issues related to this. In particular, I looked at Texas Administrative Code 213B, which addresses properties that are in the contributing zone to the Edwards Aquifer. The Texas Commission of Environmental Quality has rules that protect the surface waters of the state. This is the rule that protects those in the contributing zone. Now, even though this property is only a couple of 100 feet away from the recharge zone has a lot more stringent protections than the contributing zone. It has some protections for the contributing zone that aren't being honored by this development per se, but they're falling into a gray area of the law, so it's okay. And the gray area of the law is that this is less than 5 acres, so they don't have to abide by protections. And the protections that I'm talking about are impervious cover. If you have excess impervious cover, then any runoff that gets on there just washes any type of solutes or contaminants in that area into the watershed. They like you to limit your impervious cover to 20%. If you don't have that, they ask that you have some sort of retention facility, commonly referred to as a BMP, best managed practice. There is none in this property. And just looking at the little site plan I have, it looks like there's 60, 70% impervious cover. It's concrete driveways, parking, the rooftops. So any precipitation, flood event that happens, all that's going to go into the creek. So that's going to, there's one other stipulation in 213B, and that this be a standalone development, meaning you just can't do a bunch of small parcels less than 5 and get away with some, egregious developments that would take precedent if it was over 5 acres. So what this says to me is that this is a one-off. You're not going to allow anything else. You know, I'd like to see development in that area. I don't think this development is the best for the area, because anytime you start channelizing a stream, you're going to cause adverse impact downstream. And what we see over in French Creek is what you might be setting yourself up for here, where you have all the problems downstream, and the people downstream are going to be the ones that suffer from this, from flooding and degradation of the creek. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you, Ron. I do appreciate your taking time to come here and to talk to us. The next person I have in my little stack here is Megan Lauder. Megan Lauder? Please come forward and give us your name and address, please.
Okay, hello, my name is Megan Lauder. I live at 14814 Antonio Drive, Lotus, Texas. I had a few questions. He answered a lot of them with the drainage and all that. We live right next to the creek, so we have seen a lot of drainage coming from the development nearby, coming up and flooding the area. So he said a lot of the codes and all that, and that was the issue I'd like to address, was the drainage and the recharge zone as well.
Okay.
That was it. I
Are
was
you
just curious about that.
opposed or in favor of this?
Opposed.
Opposed.
Yes, yes, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that. Next person would be, is it Toxie Andrews? Yes. Okay. Right, sir, for the record, your name and address, please.
Toxie Andrews, I live at 14588 Antonio Drive.
Okay.
Near as I can tell, our property is directly behind the, where you're asking for the proposed variance on the easement. My concern is, not only are they higher because of the creek bed than our property, then you put a 3-story building on top of that, we're gonna lose all the privacy, and the whole reason that we purchased the property here was for some of the privacy and not having neighbors directly next door. So I just wanted to note my strong opposition to the variance. I would like it to be set back as far as possible.
Okay.
All right?
Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate you being so concise, and thank you for coming. James Lauder. Once again, sir, if I could ask you to state your name and address for the records, please.
James Lauder, 14814 Antonio Drive.
Go ahead.
Thank you for seeing us. I think most of us just became aware of this last week, so it's quite new for us. But for the third time in 8 years, water gushed into Virginia Hammond's Northwest Houston home. It was 2 a.m. on April 18th. Over the next several hours, her 2 granddaughters, aged 12 and 15, perched on tables, scared to put their feet in the gray, dark floodwater rising below them. It topped nearly 3 feet. They couldn't get in the beds because the beds were wet. They couldn't go to the bathroom because the water was over the toilet bowl. Why is Houston experiencing the increasing flooding? Scientists and other experts and federal officials say Houston's local officials have largely snubbed stricter building regulations, allowing developers to pave over crucial acres of prairie land that once absorbed huge amounts of water. That has led to an excess of floodwaters during storms that choked the city's vast bayou network, drainage systems, and 2 huge federally owned reservoirs, endangering many nearby homes, including Virginia Hammond's. What is the role of the local government? The deeper purpose of government, especially at the local level, is to establish and maintain agreements on how we get along and live together. Old Town Helotes is not a strip along Old Bandera Road. It's a loop that goes around Old Bandera Road to Antonio Drive, to Riggs Road, and then back up to Old Bandera Road with a creek that passes through the middle of it. Everything that happens on Old Bandera Road affects all of the residents behind it. This newly proposed development affects Helotes' citizens in several ways. Many of us moved to Helotes to get away from the city urban, suburban feel. We were looking for more of a country feel. The development breaches that expectation. Property values will be adversely affected. Homes within a quarter of a mile do experience a loss in value, and as the apartment ages and begins to decline, all homes in the area suffer a loss in value. Several homes behind the proposed complex, like we mentioned earlier, would suffer a loss of privacy. The building would destroy the view we currently enjoy. Lastly, most importantly, the loss of permeable land that now absorbs much of the rainwater would be lost, and the homes around and behind the complex will face additional flood concerns. Board members, as representatives of our local government, please do not make the same mistakes made by the Houston officials. We all live in or near a fragile floodplain. Any changes on the high side of the creek will have a detrimental impact on our properties. Consider the impact this development will have on all the citizens you represent.
Thank you, James. Appreciate your comments. Judith Hurst.
Thank you. My name is Judith Hurst. I live at 14855 Antonio Drive. The purpose of city government is to protect its citizens and provide relief in conflict. There have been decisions made concerning Old Town Helotes which have negatively impacted its residents. One example has been the bombardment of questionable music from 4 or 5 venues simultaneously till 2 a.m. Old Town is built in a U shape. It goes from Mander up to Antonio and wraps around the creek to our properties. In other words, we are the back of you. Old Town Helotes Special District is not a separate or sovereign entity. It is connected. Old Town is a destination for runners and bikers, but without the back of you neighbors such as the Hodges, the Cowarts, the Hearsts, the Salazars, the Louders, the Grabhorns, the Crows, the Andrews, the Hoods, the Barnetts, and the Greens, keeping up our properties, there would be no destination. Tonight, you're being asked to reach a decision concerning a variance, which would violate our privacy by building 6 structures, 1 a 3-story, 2 fire hydrants, septic tanks, B&P water overflow tanks, and fire lanes. Maybe the partridge in a pear tree too, thereby greatly increasing the impervious ground cover, thereby creating vulnerability to flood. So on one hand, you have before you a multifaceted issue which clearly breaks state law. And on the other, you have a simple issue. You have the back of you neighbors seeking relief and protection from the ongoing incursions into their privacy and tranquility. I came to the US from a country which regarded the law as sacrosanct. I came to this country because it also considered the law to be above manipulation. I worked overseas in some very dangerous environments for our government to protect the rule of law. I taught over 2,000 foreign military officers whose admiration for this country was based on the fact that we made a law and adhered to it. Now I live in an area where the law seems to depend on whimsy and wealth, where there is an impression that Old Town Special District is above the law. This does not make me proud. Maggie Grabhorn tells me that all economic development is based upon speculation. Not good enough. City Council makes decisions, leaves to go home outside Old Town Helotes, and leaves the back of you neighbors to deal with the backlash of its decisions. Please do not sell your back to you citizens down the river, or in this case, the creek. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. P.J. Kruger.
Hi, folks, gentlemen. I don't see any ladies up here, but we can address that later. My name's P.J. Kruger. I live at 13434 Antonio Drive. Some people call me Phil the Thrill. We'll talk about that later. I've lived here 32 years, probably longer than anybody else here, barring anybody? No. I've seen all kinds of development in Helotes, and unfortunately, most of it hasn't been very good. If you look up Bandera now, we call it Chicken Row. Wonder why? I've had drainage problems since they built Adobe Walls Ranch. The overflow from that floods my property every time we have a heavy rain because I'm down in a fairly low area. I've also got the creek behind me, which flooded in 87, I believe, 98, 2002, something like that. Ron, I don't have your credentials. I'm just a simple engineer of 50 years experience, but not a hydrologist. But somehow I think I know what I'm talking about. this development will not cause more flooding on my property, but it sets a precedent. We've already had precedent set. Walmart's been built. All these developments on Bandera Road. Helotes has not turned into what I moved here for. It's now a commercial enterprise. I just don't think we need to start something like this with variances that open up the creek to more flooding. In the end, covering areas with concrete, blacktop, whatever, building high-rises or not high-rises, 5-story buildings, probably is not the way to go. I'm not really in favor of it because I just don't think it's the way to go to Helotes, even though Helotes has probably already gone the wrong way. I just like you to think of it a little more seriously and what the consequences will be if we allow this to happen. It's going to go further down the road. That's it. Thank you.
PJ, could I ask you for the record to give us your full name and address again, please?
Philip James Kruger, 13434 Antonio Drive in Helotes.
Thank you, sir. Could I also ask you to return the pulpit to the, or the lectern, or whatever you want to call it, to the original position? Thank you, sir. Mike Barnett?
Thank you for letting me speak. My name is Mike Barnett, 14450 Antonio Drive. And we just recently bought a piece of property that's at the bottom there where that flood gauge is. It's been, you know, not kept up too well over in the recent past. I can remember seeing it for many years. But anyway, that's where our property is. It's adjacent to the development being proposed. We're opposed to the variance for the same reasons mentioned above, namely privacy, also watershed. In addition to that, like looking at the FEMA maps and the flood layout, you know, even a foot or two change in those flood maps significantly affects us, whether or not you're in the in the floodplain, how much water is in the, how much surface area is in the floodplain and so forth. And so for those reasons, I'm opposed to the variance. And of course, you know, I think the original intent of the law was to provide that buffer for the adjacent residents. So I think to do that, you know, kind of defeats the purpose of even having the ordinance of the law to start with. And so that's all I have to say.
Thank you, sir. I do
Thank you.
appreciate it. Leah Louder?
Hello, my name is Leah Louder, and I live at 14814 Antonio Drive. I stand in opposition to this variance. As you can see, we brought out the whole family tonight to stand in opposition. So we only found out about this about a week ago. And I think the problem is we don't know a lot about what's going on here. It sounded like Judith knew how many buildings were being put in or how many units were being put in, but I think we'd at least like a presentation from the property development representative that explains what's going to be happening in our backyards, and then provide an environmental impact analysis report as to how that would affect our floodplain, possibly a traffic impact analysis report, because if there's gonna be 1,000 units in there, multifamily units possibly, then I don't know how many there are. But if there are a significant number of units, these are 2-lane roads that get really packed whenever Floors is playing or it's Helotes Market Days. And we bought this property for the privacy and because we knew that we wouldn't be next to those multifamily residences. So we would like more information. We'd like to see how it would affect our property value. And until then, I think we all stand in opposition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I show no other citizens to be heard, is that correct? That being the case, I would like to tell the board that I asked Rick, given the fact that city staff recommended that we grant a variance, to give us a little presentation as to why city staff thinks this particular endeavor is worthy of the variance that is being requested. So with that in mind, I'd like to ask Rick to come up here, who is our city administrator, and just explain to us why he believes this variance is appropriate, best for the city, and also qualifies based on the legal rules for a variance. Rick, thank you very much.
All right.
For the record, you are, I call you Rick, but you are Rick Schroeder.
Rick Schroeder, City Administrator for Helotes. I want to thank you, Chair, for calling me up to the podium today. I will say that this item, just for some history here, this item went before both the Planning and Zoning Commission and the City Council through a conceptual site plan review process. And in doing so, at that stage is where you look at all the architectural renderings, you look at the general site plan, and it was approved by both of those entities going forward. The remaining issue is buildings 2 and 5, which are to the rear of the property, that are anywhere between 12 and 15 feet encroaching into the 30-foot residential setback that you referenced. So, the Board of Adjustment has several things that it needs to look at and consider when either granting a variance or not granting a variance. And I have summarized those. There's actually 10 questions, but several of the questions are pretty much identical. And so those questions are, does the property have any special circumstances or conditions related to it that would warrant the variance? You need to look at the strict application of the ordinance and whether that will create a hardship on any given property. You also will look to see whether the variance is in harmony with the ordinance's intent. The ordinance that we're talking about here tonight is Chapter 98, Section 72, which is quite a lengthy section that addresses everything and all things within the Old Town District. Fourth, you look at whether the variance is not merely a convenience to the applicant, and included with that is whether there are financial reasons for the applicant requesting those. Typically, those are, well, they should be dismissed if there are financial reasons for the request. The next one is granting of a variance will not confer special privileges on a particular property owner that would not be available to other property owners within the Old Town District. The next one is the variance is in the public interest and surrounding properties will be protected. Surrounding properties can be protected through a variety of ways, through the zoning code, through the tree preservation code, through landscaping provisions that we have throughout the city. So what you're looking at is whether it is generally in the public interest, in y'all's opinion, and whether the surrounding areas will be protected. And lastly, you're looking at whether the remaining regulations are adequate in governing the project, i.e. the rest of 9872 that regulates all developments that happen within the mixed-use village and the service village within Old Town. So when you take these findings of fact and you sort of group them into various categories, the first one that you're going to look at is related to the property. Well, in my opinion, the first one you're going to look at is related to the property itself. Are there any special circumstances related to that property? And will surrounding properties that abut the property be protected? What you can see here, and this is, turn these lights off. Would you turn the light off back there, please? Yeah. So the property that's in question is the rear section here. You've got Pete's Place and the shops at Old Town Helotes up here, and these are the dimensions of that property: 160 by 350. Anywhere from 160 to 350, 500, depending on whether you're abutting the creek or you're abutting the shops at Old Town. The lot is rectangular. It's a relatively small lot. It's 1.76 acres. Again, it's very narrow and it's very wide, or vice versa, depending on how you define those two words. Los Reyes Creek is to the rear. There is a significant drop-off along the creek, so in a sense, this property line is essentially the drop-off to the creek. And there is a large floodplain between the rear properties. I didn't include it on this because we talked about it the last time, but the property in question is in blue, and so you'll see the 100-year floodplain to the rear of that. It's extensive. It goes anywhere from 200 feet up to over a football size, so about 350 feet from the rear property line to the closest adjacent homes that are in accordance with Bear County Appraisal District. One of the justifications for when P and Z looked at this and when City Council looked at this project for approving the conceptual site plan was the fact that there was a considerable 100-year floodplain to the rear of that property. And so the homeowners that live on Antonio are not allowed to build any structures within the 100-year floodplain. And so looking at the rear of that development to the nearest home was a significant distance. And that wasn't the only reason that they approved the conceptual, but that is one of the reasons that they were looking at in approving the project and recommending that the project be approved at this level as well. So we look at special circumstances. I apologize for some of these pictures. I thought they were going to be better than they actually turned out to be. But the top two pictures are looking on the rear of the property down into the creek. If you look, there's essentially a ledge here where the property falls off into the bottom of the creek. And this white area here, that is the creek bottom. I would estimate, and the chair was with me, I would say anywhere from 20 to 30 feet from the top of this bluff to the bottom of where that creek bed is. The bottom pictures are looking up to the top of the property in question from the neighboring property. So there is a significant difference in height or elevation, if you will. And we wanted to make sure when we're looking at this, we were very interested when we went out there today to see what do the trees look like in that area. Because if you're talking about a 3-story structure, we wanted to see whether the trees were high enough in a sense to cover a 38-foot building. Also, what you need to look at is whether the abutting properties are protected as best as they can be protected. And so what these pictures are trying to represent or showing here is the amount of vegetation that is essentially on all 4 sides of that property in question. The inside of the property is currently used for and has grandfathered rights because it was there before the Old Town District was zoned, but it's used as creative concrete. So you'll see in subsequent pictures what the internal or the inside of that property looks compared to what's being proposed. And again, property improved. Essentially what you have is you have a mobile home structure that houses, I assume, a business office. There is a considerable amount of construction materials or construction items scattered throughout that. So we wanted to, if you haven't been out to the property, we wanted to show you what it actually looks like inside that property. The next thing, when you summarize all those findings of fact, the next thing that you're going to look at, in my opinion, would be the ordinance itself. What you want to make sure is that, is the ordinance creating a hardship on a particular property or is it not? That's one of the main things that the Board of Adjustment actually looks at. The other things you want to look at are other regulations adequate to protect neighboring property owners and to protect the aesthetic of the development itself. And the last thing you want to look at is whether the project and the ordinance, whether the intent of those two things are aligned, i.e., does the project envision what the Old Town codes are trying to do, which is build pedestrian-type friendly development that has multiple structures rather than just one large box structure.
Rick, I was going to ask a question, maybe I should let you finish, but the Board of Adjustments is here to review ordinances regarding construction and locations of properties, to answer questions regarding property lines, those kinds of things. What the Old Town Helotes development plan is, I think, is a different thing. So the point you're making right now, I don't know if it's something that should be considered in this board.
Well, the actual regulations that govern the Board of Adjustment talk about whether there are other ordinances on the books. that would mitigate the variance that's being sought. And so in this case, because the rest of the chapter 98, or excuse me, section 9872 is all about the Old Town District and regulates building sizes and things of that sort, I think it's applicable in this case. It may not be applicable in others because, but Old Town is unique because everything is located squarely within the zoning code. And that was done on purpose because you're supposed to have a higher threshold of oversight, if you will, on those types of developments.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
Looking through the Old Town codes, I just want to go over, we're talking about whether this project matches what the intent of the Old Town codes are. You can see here, and by the way, this is the actual Old Town district. You've got, the vast majority of it is mixed-use village, and this little portion up here where El Chaparral is, the church, prime time construction, that is the service village, and that allows for a little bit higher intensity of development than the rest of Old Town. But the most of Old Town is the mixed-use village. You can see that in chapter 98 it says the intent of the area west of Highway 16 is to create and maintain a pedestrian environment with a rural village character. Now the question is, does the proposed development try to do that? The next thing is informal clusters of buildings are most appropriate. A variety of setbacks are appropriate, including deep setbacks where parking occurs between and among the trees. Again, you have to question whether this development is seeking to do that. And the last thing is a mix of residential, retail, entertainment, and restaurant uses is appropriate. Upper floors are encouraged to include office or residential uses, and residential uses are intended to take advantage of scenic creek views. So I think that you could make the argument that what they are trying to do here with first-story commercial, second and third-story residential is squarely in line with what the Old Town codes say they should do. The other portions of the code that mitigate the size and type of commercial development within Old Town are some of these things. Now, I've only taken the ones that I felt were applicable in this case to justify, to not justify granting the variance, but if the Board of Adjustment grants a variance, to state that there are ordinances in place that would continue to regulate that development above and beyond just the setback issue at hand here. The first one is the impervious cover maximum. The impervious cover maximum for this property is 47.5%. The property, or the project is at or below 47.5% impervious cover, including drive aisles, buildings, all of that stuff. The other thing would be the maximum building footprint. The maximum building footprint in Old Town is 10,000 square feet. So what that means is you essentially can't have a building the size of an AutoZone get plopped down into Old Town. What they would have to do in that case would be to make that building look like it was two buildings that were 5,000 square feet each. And so there again, it's trying to mitigate the size and the overall impression from the street and from the pedestrian of these types of developments. The other thing that we're looking at is the height. The maximum height of any building within Old Town is 42 feet, which is essentially 3 standard stories. There is a buffer from the street, which is about 60 feet from Old Bandera Road into the property where you can't have third story. Everywhere else on the properties, you can have third stories. And the residential density says that you can only have 10 units or apartments per acre. Again, this property is 1.76 acres, and so they are proposing on this property to have 17 apartments, essentially, or townhomes, whatever you would like to call it. The other thing within the zoning code is this residential buffer zone. Again, that's what is at issue tonight. It states that a buffer zone of 30 feet has to be put into place where any Old Town district abuts an existing R1 zoning district. And that's what the variance request is for tonight. There's also a stream buffer zone, which essentially eliminates the ability to do any development within the Los Creek or the Los Reyes Creek area. And so there is a significant drop-off on this property, so none of the located within the floodplain or within the stream buffer would be allowed to be developed, with the exception of trails and things of that sort. And those, by the way, are not a part of this project. They're not proposing any trails in the creek. One of the other things is that it doesn't require plazas or public spaces or paths, but it certainly encourages that the types of developments that occur in Old Town have these types of things incorporated into them. And then you have maximum parking pod size. So what Old Town codes are trying to do is break up large parking lots. And I believe the maximum parking is 30 vehicles, 30 to 45 vehicles. This development doesn't have anywhere near that, but it is attempting you to break up parking, and so you don't have a sea of parking essentially on that project. Tree preservation, all the tree preservation regulations that are within Chapter 94 would still apply to this project, and so there would be significant mitigation costs. Well, most of the trees that are on this project would need to be preserved, but they're on the property lines anyway. So I don't see the issue with the abutting property owners being able to see this through the trees that are there into this development. Of course, you have landscaping requirements as well. One of the big things about landscaping requirements is that it mandates the size of landscaping beds, so they have to be a minimum of 6 feet. And so what you can see here is that the Old Town codes basically force you to put a lot of these things into your project, and they take up space, okay? Good space. I mean, I don't think anybody would argue that plazas or fountains are bad, but they take up space nonetheless. And so they push what you can do to a site to essentially the limit. And one of the biggest things here is the International Fire Lane. Now, because it is going to be anywhere from 1 to 2 to 3 stories, there does need to be an adequate fire lane to be able to service those 5 or 6 buildings that are being proposed. And so that is something that we can't get rid of. We're not gonna give a variance to the fire code. And so that is a significant component of this project, and you'll see in just a second. This, and I have a feeling that people may or may not have seen what the actual project is going to look like. You can see that it consists of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 buildings. And we do have the architect here, so if there's anything that I say that's incorrect, I'm sure that they will address it. But what you're trying to do, and I put all the various code requirements here, around here, to show that there's not a lot of room in order to do this type of development on this lot, okay? So you have building footprint and modules, so you have, again, it broken up into multiple buildings. You have an irregular or a very small lot shape on this property. You also have tree preservation and landscaping requirements that are required. You have a huge plaza and fountain. There's also a fountain to the rear here as well. You have this area right here is, of course, the turnaround for the fire apparatus. And there's also a pathway here for the fire apparatus to be able to get to the rear of these sections here. We talked about parking pods in the sense that they're scattered throughout, either throughout the project or they're underneath the second story of some of these buildings. There are impervious cover requirements, regulations. Essentially, it's trying to limit the amount of impervious cover that are here. You have the perimeters of this lot that are heavily treed. You have, again, building clusters. And you have what's at issue really here is the significant drop-offs, the floodplain, and the residential and stream buffer zones that we can't build in. So when you add all of these things together, which I don't think anybody would argue, maybe they would, but for me, this is a relatively nice-looking development, in my opinion, particularly for Old Town. I don't think anybody would say that this is a bad-looking project. Well, all of these things that are required, again, take up space. And so that is why I think that the applicant has a valid concern and a valid point when they're saying that they would like to encroach anywhere from 12 to 15 feet on that rear property line. And again, the other thing I go back to is there's a significant drop-off and a significant floodplain. application to agree with me. But from staff's perspective, when we're looking at this, we're saying, does the property have special circumstances or conditions? In my opinion, the lot shape, the size of the lot itself, the floodplain and the creek bed, and the drop off in the rear, can make an argument that the property does have special circumstances or conditions. Will the strict application of the ordinance create a hardship? In my opinion, a hardship is that having to move those buildings at any other location eliminates amenities within the proposed project that are what we are desiring within Old Town, i.e. limiting the fountain space, the plazas, that kind of stuff. The variance also has to be in harmony with the ordinance's intent. I believe the project typifies desirable Old Town Road special district developments. I think this is both P and Z and City Council had the same comments. They felt that this was exactly the type of development that we would like to see in Old Town. That's a higher quality type of development that does what the Old Town codes are trying to do, which is the whole live, work, play type concept. The variance also can't merely be a convenience to the applicant. I don't believe it's a convenience to the applicant because it's essential to preserve other project enhancements. And the granting of the variance cannot confer special privileges. The applicant is not trying to build within the floodplain. I don't believe that this is going to give the property owner any more advantages than any other property would have throughout the district. This is really one of the only landlocked pieces of property. There are a handful, but there aren't many pieces of property that are landlocked to this regard. The variance has to be in the public interest, and surrounding properties have to be protected. I know people in the audience will likely disagree with me on this, but there are significant trees on the property. All of them, or most if not all, and they can address this, will be preserved as a part of this project. There are strict tree and landscaping provisions that we have that will apply to this project. And again, there's a significant number of trees on the property perimeter. The last thing is the remaining regulations are adequate in governing the project. I would argue that throughout the entire city, that the Old Town district regulations are the strictest of any zoning district that we have throughout the city. I think that they are substantial. I think there's a lot of things that would essentially eliminate the ability to have a big box or something that people would not like to see in the Old Town district. Are there any questions on that? Or do you have any questions?
We can ask questions now, or we can move to discussion and ask questions as we go along.
Yeah, I mean,
I would almost propose that we do that. Does that sound, unless somebody has some questions right now?
well,
Go ahead.
with everything that's been said, then I really only have one question, and that is roughly how far is it from the property line itself to, say, the back of these folks' houses that surround it? Is it, 50 feet, 100 feet?
It is anywhere from 224 feet to 333 feet, 330 feet, excuse me.
Okay. So basically 200 and a quarter to over 300.
Yes.
Other questions for Rick?
I do have a question.
Go ahead.
So Rick, the proposal really centers around buildings 2 and 5. That's what the variance is sought for.
Yes.
If those 2 buildings were taken out, could this project then proceed?
The only thing that is preventing the project from proceeding are those portions of those buildings that are located within, not even the entire, not all of each building itself is within that setback. So that's the only thing that's preventing this project from moving forward.
Okay.
Can they be moved? I'm sure the applicant will tell you, yeah, they can be moved. But I think in doing so, again, you're gonna eliminate some of the stuff that's nice about this project. And that's the heartburn I have about trying to move those buildings.
Okay, but if they were eliminated,
The project would go forward. Everything that is being proposed on this project is allowed by right,
okay,
with the exception of the encroachment to the rear.
okay. Thank you.
One thing I will say about these codes, if you
Thank you.
I'll continue to move from my left to my right. Charles?
Yeah, no more questions. Thank you, Rick.
No more question? Claire?
I'm good.
I don't have any questions. Thank you.
All righty. That in mind, can I get somebody to motion that we move into discussion?
I make a motion, we move into discussion.
Can I get a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Very good. Let's move into discussion. And again, as is my custom, I will start over here. Rob?
Okay. So the Board of Adjustments we're governed. We have to follow rules that are set for us by the state. And going through the determination, in order to grant a variance, there have to be special conditions. And those conditions have to be in question to the size, shape, or topography. But it also has to mean that the conditions are peculiar to the piece of property involved. And most importantly, that the issue at hand is not being caused by the applicant. Now, we had a request a month ago to make a change in a variance because of a building that burned down, having to do with impervious cover. The building was under the old rules, the building burned down, they had to rebuild under the new rules. I felt at that time that the owner was entitled to a variance because that was beyond their control. That was not something they brought upon themselves. This, on the other hand, strikes me as completely the opposite. The lot size is what it is. You can build only so much on a lot. It's just basic physics. You cannot put more on there than what should be. And the land is basically telling the property owner that the project's too big. Rick's already confirmed that the project without those two buildings can proceed. No further variance is required. So I'm not in agreement with the argument that there is a hardship that's being created here outside of the desire of the property owner to want to put more buildings on there.
If I can address just one thing, I want to make it clear that I'm in no way, I haven't had the discussion with the property owner on this. So if you eliminate those two buildings, the property owner may well decide to forgo the project. So I'm not saying that the project won't go away if you
Right.
eliminate. I'm just saying, I'm sure that anybody would understand if I said that you can probably move those two buildings and the project will proceed. So that's what I'm saying, just to be
Right.
clear.
Right, I understand.
Okay.
Yeah, I think for
Does everybody else on the board understand that and
yeah,
grasp that?
my understanding is that there are no other regulations that would stop the property owner from developing a development of this type, except for the encroachment into the rear setback right now. Everything else has passed.
That's correct.
Okay.
Charles, was that your only discussion on?
You know, I had a couple of things that I wanted to bring out. I want to make sure, as Robert said, we're trained regularly on the rules of the board and how we work with planning and zoning, how we work with city council and the mayor. And so, having gone through the training, I look at this paperwork regularly and I try to adhere to it. Coming back to the issue of hardship, I think that I'll make a comment pretty similar to Robert's. 10 units per acre maximum, 1.7 acres, the math says 17 units. That's maxing out the property's capacity, and it's the most that would be allowed under the special district zoning that we have. But that's only one rule, and the property owner could develop a smaller development and fit within the rules as they're set. So from a hardship standpoint, I think it would be akin to someone coming in saying, I'd like to build a 12,000 square foot house on a quarter acre, but I don't have enough space on my land. Can you give me a little bit of leeway so that I can go ahead and encroach on all the property lines, for example? So it's I stress the severity there a little bit, but kind of a similar argument. I worry also about a special circumstance. That's another of the bullets that we have that was shown tonight. you know, as many of those that stood up and spoke for themselves, Helotes has a lot of creeks. There's frontage everywhere in the city. And so if we decide to allow a setback change on one creek front, then we have set a precedent for all the creek fronts. And even just on the creek we're speaking of, there's several properties along there that could become part of that precedent. And so I have some concern. Is the variance in the public interest? Many of the neighbors and residents that live very close say no to the development. I recognize that there might be personal opinions regarding, do you want this kind of development or not? I think Rick was astute in saying that the development ordinances were set up several years ago, and the way that we change those is by going back through city council and through mayors and elections and things like that. So that's not what we're talking about tonight. But what we are talking about is that the closest neighbors do feel like they're being affected. They're asking us not to change the law to allow the ordinance to be breached. And so my recommendation there is that I listen to those many neighbors that did speak. Rick, thank you very much for making comments regarding the recommendation by City Council or recommendation by the Planning and Zoning. I think the recommendation I now understand, I think I understood, is the Planning and Zoning and the City Council are supporting the Old Town Economic Development Plan and recommend a development like this because it does fill many of the goals of the plan that was set some years ago. So I understand the recommendation that way. We're not in an issue of contract zoning or making deals with developers and pushing those through. So I'm very happy that this one made it all the way through the process, and we looked at it at every level. And so tonight, I hope that we make a good decision on best next step forward. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Charles? I'm sorry, Blair. Excuse me, please.
Everybody's made good points so far, but the thing that bothers me somewhat is the fact that with any design job, and I'm not without experience in that line of work, it comes with constraints. They can be, will it fit through the door? Things like that. And these are typically laid out in the beginning of a project. And, it seems like they followed all of the other constraints that they have. It seems like a design could have been come up with, you could come up with a design which would reduce the encroachment on that setback, particularly in the case of Building 2. It's easy to see that Building 5 would be, there would be a corner of the building. We've allowed things like that in the past, and there's precedent for that certainly, but it just bothers me they made all of the constraints except one.
I'm done. Thank you.
Paul?
Thank you, Rick, for going through the findings of fact. I think the case is compelling to grant the variance. I think the request is reasonable. The amount of the building that's going to be encroaching is fairly small. So this project could go forward with that little bit of encroachment. I don't think it's that significant. I think the city has been for years trying to get these kinds of developments here. I've been on EDC and city council for years and years and years here, and that's what we have intended to do with Old Town and the investments that we've made in Old Town for years. So that's why I don't see an issue with granting this variance.
Okay. I'd like to just share a few thoughts, if you don't mind. I went out with Rick today and walked the property, trying to understand exactly what was at issue. I believe some of my other board members have pointed out that some of the things that were brought up here, though I can understand them as concerns for somebody who owns property in that area, are not things that we address here. I've invested in properties here, there, and everywhere, and sometimes I've had a neighbor come along and do something next door that I sure wish they hadn't done. We're not here to protect that. That is not our job. Our job is to strictly look at the law, the potential problem, and then to see if somebody should be granted a variance based on this specific issue. We're not here to judge whether we like three-story or two-story buildings. That's already in the zoning code. That's beyond our ability to rule upon. We're not here to say we like a specific design or not. That is not what we are here for. We are here to basically say, should those two buildings be granted the right to go further than they should toward the property line? That's basically it. Walking the property today, I noticed a few things. Quite frankly, initially, I was skeptical of this particular development. But walking the property today, I noticed a few things. One is that some of this particular lot, yes, it's kind of an odd-shaped lot. It doesn't even butt on the street, which creates more of an issue for the particular developer. But some of this lot has some pretty heavy requirements on it. A good chunk of it is going to be taken up just by a turnaround lane for the fire department. Totally outside the realm of whether or not the builder is seeking to maximize his gain. It's strictly as a safety issue, and we have that a couple of places there. One of the things I always look for, and I'm concerned about, when we put a property closer than we should to a property line, is there a certain amount of, I guess, privacy, the sense of why people move to Helotes. And yes, I too live in Helotes, and I too have some neighbors that are very close on some sides, and on the other side, they're really far away. I love it. That's not what we're here for. And as I looked to the back, and I said, well, if these buildings were here, and then looked at the trees all along that creek bed, which again creates a problem, because we have in the past, as we've discussed variances, looked at topography and said, well, you know, it does sure cost a lot more if there's a real steep drop at the back of the property, and somebody has to then develop in that particular area where they might have to put up a 20 or 30-foot retaining wall just to support a building. We have granted variances in those cases and said that is a hardship that's unique to this particular property. Behind this particular property, part of it, you know, you take a few steps and you'll drop down 30 feet, ballpark. I'm not real good at gauging that, but I have seen us grant variances where the variance has been for a 5 or a 10 or even a 15-foot fall off in the back. The neighbor to as we look at this particular development, if you look to the right, there's a retaining wall there that holds this particular property up. It probably, again, I'm going to ballpark it, 10-foot retaining wall, 12-foot retaining wall. Just because of the topography, again, it really drops back there. And I guess as I look at this property and ponder not just what our citizens want. And again, I live in Helotes, I have a sense for what you want, but also understanding what the city wants in terms of developing this specific area, which is something that's been decided not here, will not be decided here, been decided years ago. I just think this is a superb use of that particular piece of property, and the little bits of projection that go out in the back, there are 30 and 40-foot trees, people on the other side will not see it, and there are in fact steep declines that I think would say that this particular property qualifies for hardship based on the topography of the property. I think I'm done talking. Other discussion, gentlemen?
The only thing I'll say is that in the past, we've had people relocate carports and over significant, minuscule differences. And, looking at that, at those precedents, I think we have to keep those in mind if we, if we do decide to actually vote for this, because this is a big, big variance.
I agree. Can we go around again? Charles?
Yeah, I'd only point out that the variance that's requested is larger than normal for us. It's, you look at the property from the top and it's 1.7 acres, but that building number, is it 5? That's the closest? I'm thinking that's the one.
Is that the one that's 15 feet? Yeah.
I think it's under the flyout that says building clusters.
Okay, but I think that one of the variances is 10 feet, the other's 17?
No, I think it's 15 and 17, if I'm not mistaken.
Let's see if we can find it here so that we
Let us do
have a
that
good
so we
measurement.
have an exact, yep.
I want to clarify how close that building is to the cliff.
It's approximately 13 feet and 17 feet.
So the variance request is 13 and 17, or, okay, so a 17 variance would leave us 13 feet to the edge of the cliff, or to the property edge.
Yes.
And so, that's already close enough that, I'd ask my engineers to come out and verify that you've got the subsurface that's capable of holding it, if you're putting a 2-story building or 3-story building on there. I'm not here to do the engineering, but that's pretty close. 13 feet is less than the distance between Rick and myself. And so, building to the cliff. So that's in my eyes, that's a fairly large variance that's being requested. Yeah.
Okay.
I guess I'd point out as well that I own property and I've bought property that has floodplain in it. And, a lot of times, that's the prettiest part of the property. And so, you don't buy it to build a house on it. You buy it because you love it and you love all the trees and the view and the water that's in there regularly. So, myself included, I'm not going to discount the value of floodplain and the property owner's right to enjoy it. Okay.
Great observation. Blair?
I don't have anything further.
Paul?
I don't believe I have anything else. Thank you.
I have nothing else. Might I ask for a motion that we move to vote, given no more need to discuss?
Motion to close discussion.
Motion to close discussion?
Second.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Discussion's closed. Can I get a motion on this particular matter?
Yeah, Robert, I'll move to approve a request by Cesar Hernandez for the variance to the Municipal Code of Ordinances, Chapter 98 zoning, Article 2, District Regulations, Section 9872, Old Town Helotes Special District, authorizing an encroachment in the required residential buffer zone of 30 feet or a street plus 10 feet where any Old Town Helotes subdistrict abuts an existing single-family residential district, 2-family residential district, and mobile home district for Haciendas Del Rio Development Building 2 and Building 5 located 14743 Old Bandera Road, Helotes, Texas 78023. More particularly described as BCAD property ID 1046345. Sufficient?
That sounds fine, but I want to make sure I heard you
I move
correct?
to approve the request.
Approve the variance.
Yes.
Approve the request for a variance.
I'll second.
Paul, you will second?
Chair, may I
Yes,
ask a
sir.
question?
Go ahead.
I did not ask the property owner to come up or do any sort of discussion in front of the board. Would you, if they would like to address the board, would you entertain that?
I would never argue in favor of ignorance, so if somebody has some additional information, I would be in favor of that. You all kind of feel the same way? I would ask them to keep that same requirement in terms of time frame.
And again, I don't know if they want to speak, I just know that they're here, and I want to make sure that if there was anything I said in my presentation that was incorrect, that they have the ability to address that.
Is that all right?
That's okay.
Do I need to vote on this? Anybody have a problem with me saying yes? Not opposed? Nobody's opposed? Very good. Thank you. So your name and your address, please.
My name is Nicholas Meldy. My address is 318 Sadie Street, San Antonio, Texas.
Very good.
I'm the architect representing Cesar Hernandez, and just wanted to say thank you to part of the residents who came by tonight to offer their feedback on this. We have, taken a good amount of time and good measures to, try to fulfill what the Old Town Helotes plan has tried to develop here. And so with that, we developed a cluster of buildings that instead of one larger mass of buildings, and so that inhabitants here could, enjoy some of the characteristics of Helotes that many of the current residents enjoy. And so with that, the main thing, I think, the main thing I wanted to point out here is that these aren't just apartments. They are considered mixed use, I'm sorry, it's mixed use live work. And so the intent is for the inhabitants to work on the ground floor and occupy the second and third levels as one building unit. Rather than doing apartments or just commercial, something like that, we wanted people to live in the same place that they worked. And I think that starts to represent a more independent, spirit, I think, amongst business owners and the inhabitants for Helotes. And so, thank you guys for entertaining this today, and appreciate y'all's service. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Can I then ask a question?
Certainly, sir.
If they are proposing that the tenant that occupies the retail space on the bottom lease the spaces above, is that going to be a requirement to do that?
My personal understanding is no, but I will ask the architect because I don't know that for sure.
That is an option. Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Yes, Rick mentioned something that
Could you please come forward and mention your name again?
I'm sorry.
That's all right. I just try to keep things organized.
Judith
here.
Hurst, 14855 Antonio,
Thank you.
in Old Town Helotes.
Okay.
Rick mentioned something about a hardship, and there was some discussion among you, and I believe that one or two of you mentioned that it wasn't a hardship, that they could put fewer buildings or the project with fewer buildings on it. In other words, somebody, how do I say this politically?
You don't have to be political. Please just
Well,
be truthful and honest.
somebody is a bit greedy with the land and asking for land that is not theirs. We haven't talked, and this is probably not the place, but we haven't talked about the access road, of which there is none. And I think Mr. Dempsey and Mr. Holtz own part of that road, so we have not discussed that. the fire chief, as far as I know, from doing research, has not been approached about this project. But I guess, Rick, could you explain to me about the hardship? In other words, you're asking for a variance because of a hardship, such as the gym that burned down, and it was not the fault of the person, and it created a hardship. So is this, are you saying or not saying that this variance should be granted because of a hardship requirement? Did I phrase that right?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer that question. It was my opinion, and again, my opinion is my opinion alone. It has nothing to do with the Board of Adjustment. But it was my opinion that since this property is landlocked, and since there are going to be additional requirements on it for public safety, that there is a legitimate case to be made that there's a hardship on this property. Now, whether the board agrees with me or not is one thing. I will say that that is why that there are 5 members on the Board of Adjustment, because everybody's has their individual opinions, and those opinions can vary. So if this was an administrative matter and the law was black and white, then there would be no need to have the Board of Adjustment.
Okay. My next question is, the 3 trailers that are on the property now, do they belong to Mr. Hernandez?
Ma'am, that's beyond the scope
Okay,
of
okay.
what we're hearing. We could discuss this.
No,
but
but what I'm just saying, if something is not in compliance and has not been in compliance for many, many years.
That is not something, I thank you for bringing it up, but again, that's way beyond the scope of what we're here to discuss. Thank you for understanding.
And if I may, for the record, the other question that you asked regarding thoroughfare and access, it was brought up at the previous meeting, May 7th, and one of the agenda items tonight is for us to discuss the minutes of that meeting and approve the minutes. And so that may arise again tonight in the other agenda item.
Okay, so we have so far a motion to approve?
Yes,
One.
indeed.
Okay, can I get a second?
Second.
Second to that motion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
This is to carry the motion.
This is to carry the motion. Okay, so we have a motion.
Aye.
And you carry the motion. So the motion is to approve the variance. Okay. Given that motion, can we have a vote? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Opposed.
Opposed.
In order to get a variance here, one needs to get 4 out of 5 of the members of the Board of Adjustment to grant the variance. Given the fact that there were only 3 out of 5, the variance will be declined. No, please, we're. Is there any other business that needs to be brought to the Board of Adjustment this evening other than the approval of the minutes? Gentlemen, have you all had a chance to review the minutes? Does anybody here have a significant or substantial problem with the minutes as drafted?
I did have one point.
Folks, could I ask you to please? Thank you.
So in the minutes, I don't know if they're attached to this document, but
Okay, go ahead. I have one here. Go
there
ahead.
was a point that Phil, I'm trying to remember the last name, spoke at the last meeting. He's the owner of Wine 101. He had his lawyer with him at May 7th. He asked specifically about the same question, how will the road be considered for access? And he had made the request that the city work with the other tenants in that area, I believe, to make a plan. It didn't make it into the minutes. He was in support of the development, but
Correct.
but wanted the minutes to reflect that he had concern over the road and access and how that would be enabled. So I'd ask that if we can edit the minutes to include that comment that was made by Phil at the last meeting.
Very good.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other issues with the minutes as so constructed?
No.
Well, if I could get city staff to do that, I would appreciate it, and then I guess I will officially sign the minutes to the last meeting and this one as well. Is there any other business that needs to be tended to this evening before the board? It is now 8:23, and meeting is closed. Thank you.